Hello everyone and welcome to Season of War. Tonight we are back for another short Age of Sigmar video. My name is Fabian and today we're gonna talk about how to be a good opponent in Age of Sigmar. Without further ado, let's get started. So this is a topic I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and I'd like to start with saying that this is my opinion and it's not a generic truth, but I think that if everyone was following what we're gonna see in this video, all the games would be more enjoyable for everyone. In this video, we're gonna first cover the player's code from the General's Handbook, as it is actually pretty interesting in the way it's written and a good base. Then we're gonna go over measuring and moving models, playing by intent, takebacks, and finally chess clocks. So first, for the player's code, we have two cardinal rules: always be polite and respectful, always tell the truth and never cheat. This might sound obvious, but it's not always the case, and especially on the definition of cheating, as we're gonna see later. There are a lot of principles here as stated by Games Workshop. We are not going to go over all of them, but there are a few that I would like to talk about. First is to give your opponent time to see before picking up your dice, and linked to that, a good practice is actually to remove fail rolls, so this way your opponent can take a look at your success and see if you forgot one. If you pick up your success, he can't see if you accidentally picked one that was a fail. Always be polite, explain all your rules, especially if your opponent asks, and offer to if they don't, and shake your opponent's hand and wish them good luck at the end of deployment before the game starts. Games Workshop says to never complain about your luck. I think it's healthy to do it a bit as long as it doesn't become a problem. And one thing with that though is also, if you want to complain about your luck, you can do it, but you should also acknowledge your opponent's good plays that maybe put them in this situation. You can complain also about your bad play, but again, try to not make it just about yourself and celebrate your opponent's successes. Again, here is really being a good human person. You want to be respectful to your opponent and really make sure that they are having a good time. This game is not just about winning. We are all spending a lot of time and money to play this game, and especially when we go to events, we really want to make sure that both parties are having good time independently on the outcome of the game. We're gonna now pass to the next steps, as this is Games Workshop's player code and you can find that in your General's Handbook. Everyone should read it and reread it, as it's really the base for everything else, but again, we don't want to spend too much time on that. The first one of the big topics that I wanted to discuss here is how to measure and move models. For our main rules here, I would like to highlight the fact that moving models and measuring is very critical in Age of Sigmar. You always want to make sure that you measure and move models with accuracy to maintain fairness in the game and not take any advantage. Sloppy measurements, whether intentional or not, are cheating. If you add an inch move because you're not measuring precisely, it's the same thing as saying that your unit moves 7 inches when it moves 6. Again, it might not be intentional, but it has a big impact on the outcome of the game. So measuring precisely is very critical and is going to help you be a better opponent. Especially because it's very easy to get frustrated by an opponent doing sloppy measurements. You don't really want to correct them every single time, but it just builds up frustration during the game. And again, that's not something that we want. The second point is about being not sloppy with moving a unit, then moving it back, and then trying to move something else. You want to be intentional on that. When you finish measuring a unit, you can say, okay, I'm good with this one, I move on to the next one. There are exceptions, and you can mark movement if you want to do so, but in general, we don't want to have to go back and forth because your unit is gonna probably not be in the exact same position, and again, that might make you gain another inch of movement, and again, it's gonna be sloppy. Then for the principles, the first one is to keep your tools grounded. What I mean by that is that whether you're using a measuring tape or sticks, when you're measuring something precise like movement, or if you're trying to check for distances between unit and it's close to, you don't know if it's in or out, put your measurement tools on the board. It's recommended to use measurement sticks, it helps a lot, but if you want to use a measurement tape, it also works. Just flip it, put it on the board in front of the unit and see where the measurement goes. Measuring in the air is never precise. To move model, mark the maximum distance that the model can move. When you put your measurement stick or your measuring tape, put either your finger or a dice at the end and make sure that you move up to the distance and not further. There is nothing worse than having a measurement stick and then moving the model at the same time as removing it and end up moving quite further. It just removes the whole point of using measurement stick. If you want to speed up movement for units, you can measure the first one and the last one and just maintain the same formation. Just don't measure correctly for the first one and move everything else in the back and have the back move 2 or 3 more inches, because they just go on the side and end up moving a lot more than what they are supposed to. When you're moving, if you need to rotate your base, it's not a free movement. You have to keep that into account as well. So make sure you don't gain extra movement, especially with oval bases. Next, on to pile-ins. They are very important as they might determine the outcome of a fight. Use 3-inch markers and try to be precise. And then finally, if you have movement that you're unsure about, or if you want to set up some particular auras and like you need to move multiple units as one, for all these scenarios, either use empty bases or at least mark the position of the units before they move. So this way, if you need to come back, you will know exactly where they were. That goes together with saying that like you should pre-measure as much as possible to make sure that when you actually do the movement, you end up in a way that is precise and that has been checked before that it was actually possible. So that's it for measuring and moving models. Again, the idea is really here to be precise. It has a very big impact on the game, and it can be quite frustrating for the opponent when it's done in a sloppy way. Next, we have playing by intent. That's something that we hear a lot, but that some people don't actually understand. The rule here is to clearly state your intent. Whether you're measuring, planning on doing some actions, saying that the unit is going to stay whole even free, or that if when you charge, you have to pile into another unit. For all of that, you want to make sure that you say it out loud. Your opponent can't read your mind, so if you don't say something, you can't expect that it's going to be upheld. And when you agree on something, you have to stick to it. If you agree that like after charging, you're going to be able to stay outside of 3 of that unit, and both opponents agree, you can't then come back and be like, oh, actually you're within 2.9 so I can fight. Doesn't matter what the situation is. If you agreed something with your opponent, stick to it. Onto the principles, playing by intent doesn't allow you to do something that's impossible. When you announce something, you have to make sure, and your opponent has to check with you, that it's actually doable. Like if 2 units are close to each other and there's not a lot of room, you can't just say, oh, I want to stay outside of 3 of this unit if it's physically not possible. So that's something that you want to make sure, and you want to make sure that you check with your opponent. The goal of playing by intent is really to speed up the game, and that you avoid arguments over minor measurements with your opponent, keeping the game moving smoothly and efficiently. Again, and it's very important, playing by intent requires both players' mutual agreement, so make sure that you communicate things clearly and that your opponent agrees with you. If no intent was announced for a situation, either because you wanted to keep something secret or because you forgot, you have to revert to measurements. That's when you're gonna measure precisely to determine the outcome. However, you want to prioritize sportsmanship for minor mistakes and be a bit lenient when it's appropriate. If your opponent announces the center and is 3.1 away from the middle and there is nothing you could have done to prevent it, you should not be nitpicking on that. However, if they made a strategic mistake, like engaging one of your units where they didn't necessarily have to because they did not measure, that's a strategic mistake and they should be punished for it. In other words, always prioritize sportsmanship, which is actually a good transition to the next points I want to cover, which is takebacks. Nobody is perfect, we are not robots, so there will be times in the game where you will want to ask for a takeback. The first thing with takeback is to make sure that you set expectations early. Before the game begins, when you do your start of game speech, you want to make sure that you agree with your opponent on what type of game you want and what you want to do for takebacks. Either no takebacks at all, or if they are allowed, to what extent. And same as before, once you've reached an agreement, stick to this agreement, don't try to change the rules mid-game. Regarding the principles of takebacks. First, you want to make sure that you play as cleanly as possible to avoid having to ask for takebacks. If you ask for one, ask politely and respect your opponent's decision. Never abuse your opponent, playing very sloppy, trying to get advantage because they are too nice. One thing that might happen in game is sometimes misunderstandings due to either cultural differences, different languages, or things like that. In these cases, always address these issues calmly and respectfully. On the opposite spectrum as trying to abuse your opponent by playing sloppy, also do not abuse your opponent by being too strict. It's important to play clean, but again, we are not robots and you don't want to abuse your opponent and especially force mistakes through pressure. You always want to prioritize fairness and empathy in every interaction. And last point, you want to be proactive in fair play. If your opponent clearly forgets an action or a move that they are intending to do, and you notice it, can re-offer them a reminder. You want to promote a fair game even when it does not benefit you. It might happen that you don't see something, and then you can see how to address it later. But if you see your opponent clearly forgetting to move a unit when they say that they would move it there for a tactic, just tell them, hey, you forgot your unit. If you realize that your opponent forgot to charge somewhere, again, remind them. But again, here the important is to remember that players are not robots, and you want to remind people when they do a mistake that you notice, and be a bit lenient for takebacks when it's about minor mistakes or things that were like obviously intended. At the same time, and that's where the balance is hard to find, you don't want to be too nice, and if an opponent does a strategic mistake, then you have to be firm and explain them that nope, they made a mistake, they have to suffer the consequences. Try to separate strategic mistakes and minor human mistakes. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is chess clocks. That's a topic that's often frowned upon in the community, especially in some countries. As per everything, you want to agree with your opponent before the game whether you want to use a clock or not, and if you want to use one, what type of clock you want. Either a hard clock or something a bit more flexible to favor sportsmanship. And again, stick to the agreement. If you decide to use something, don't try to change the rules mid-game. A chess clock is a tool that is meant to make sure that both players have the same amount of time and that the game reaches a natural conclusion. It should not be used as a weapon to win games that would otherwise be lost. When using a clock, I recommend to promote sportsmanship and not play with a hard clock. In a flexible setup, if one of the players runs out of time, but it's like really close to the end of the game and they only need a few minutes, and if the other player has time, offering that time to the opponent is good sportsmanship. In addition, discussing the end of the game is always preferable to just clock your opponent. When it's clear what the outcome will be, you don't want a player just running out of time to be what decides the outcome of the game. Again, it goes back to the intent of the clock being making sure that the game reaches a natural conclusion and should not be used to win a game that will otherwise be lost. The goal of the clock is to make sure that there is no slow play from either side, and even in a flexible setup, if one player runs out of time in their third turn and the opponent still has like 2 full rounds to play, in that case they will have to follow the rules clock, which is you can't play anymore, you only do your mandatory actions. Flexible and sportsmanship doesn't mean that the clock is useless, it's just you want to make sure that it's not abused. And speaking of abuse, you should avoid exploiting the clock. Don't waste time during your opponent's turn, don't try to distract them when the clock is on their time. Again, use the clock fairly to make sure that the game runs smoothly. Also, if your opponent never used the clock before, offer them to be using it. Be mindful of not forgetting to use the clock for their time as well as yours, and make sure that everyone has a good time. In the end, a clock should only be used to make sure that games reaches a natural conclusion and that both players are happy, that there is no frustration having played less than your opponent. And it also helps at some point, if you see that you have time, just take a step back, think your turn, maybe even spend a few minutes without creating frustration for your opponent that might feel like you're using his time. As much as I would always recommend to play with a clock, because it's a great tool to make sure that games are finished and there is nothing more frustrating than running out of time, especially when the game is close. I would also like to insist on not playing with a hard clock unless very specific situation, like maybe the World Championship if both players agree. But in general, you don't want to win a game just because your opponent could not finish his bottom of 5 because he ran out of time and needed 30 more seconds. If you can talk the end of the game, or if you have time left and you can give it to your opponent, it's always preferable, making sure that the game reaches a natural conclusion. Clocking an opponent should be exceptional, and in fact, what you're gonna see is that when players are using a clock, even if they are usually slow, they usually tend to play faster and games finish in time. That's all I wanted to discuss for today. That's something that's like very important for me, making sure that both players have a good time in a game to promote sportsmanship, but also at the same time to be precise in your measurement, know your rules. You can be the most fun opponent ever. If you cheat or play sloppy, you will not give your opponents a good experience. On the other hand, even if you are an introvert and don't like to speak, as long as you play a very clean game, no one will be able to have any complaint, and it will always be enjoyable. A lot of it just sounds to be logical things, just being a good human, but unfortunately we see that it's not always the case. So try to be mindful of the way you play, always be respectful, and don't try to win at all costs. It's never worth it. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Not trying to win at all costs. When you're playing against a human. Try to show empathy, be respectful, and be the best version of yourself. And most importantly, don't do to others what you would not like done to yourself. So be the opponent that you would like to play against. And with that, that's all I had to say on being a good opponent for Age of Sigmar. Please let us know in the comments what you think. And may all your games of Age of Sigmar be enjoyable. See you in the next one.